The bank said the land would sell for $280,000. It sold for $194,500. The man who bought it paid $194,500 out of a cashier's check he had drawn at a different bank 3 days before the auction, because he already knew it would sell for less than the appraisal, and he had done the math in a spiral notebook at his kitchen table, and the math told him what to bring. The man who bought it was the same man the first bank had foreclosed on. His name was Gerald Tatum. He was 54 years old, and by 10 minutes past noon on the third Thursday of April 2009, he was standing in the parking lot of the Colfax County, Nebraska courthouse with a certificate of sale in his hand and 312 acres of bottomland corn ground back in his name. He went home and ate lunch. He did not tell anyone what he had done until his daughter called that evening. This is the kind of story my father would have told. If yours would have too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. The 312 acres had been in the Tatum family since 1947, when Gerald's father, a man named Leland Tatum, had bought the south half of a section in Colfax County out of a federal resettlement program that was liquidating land it had acquired during the Depression. Leland had paid $38 an acre. He had borrowed $6,000 of the $11,400 purchase price from a cousin in Columbus, Nebraska, who was a machinist at a John Deere dealer and who had been saving steadily since 1938. Leland paid the cousin back in 4 years in cash, and from that point on the 312 acres carried no debt. It carried no debt for 49 years. Then Leland died in 1996, and Gerald inherited the farm and the habit of running it clean, and for another 9 years the ground stayed unencumbered. In 2005, Gerald borrowed against it $210,000 from First County Bank in Schuyler, Nebraska, to buy a grain bin complex and put in a center pivot irrigation system on the East 80. It was a sound investment. Corn prices were climbing. The East 80 would produce 190 bushels an acre under the pivot where it had been producing 140 dry land. The numbers worked, or they worked the way numbers work, when the price of corn cooperates. The price of corn cooperated until 2008, and then a great many things stopped cooperating at once. And First County Bank reviewed its agricultural loan portfolio in the fall of that year, and found Gerald Tatum's $210,000 note in a category the bank called elevated risk, which in practice meant they had decided they wanted the note resolved one way or another before the next fiscal year. They sent a letter in November. They sent another in January. In March of 2009, they filed a foreclosure action in Colfax County District Court. Gerald Tatum was not asleep when the bank filed. That part of the title is a way of saying something true about how foreclosure feels rather than how it happens. It comes on paperwork you didn't read carefully enough, on a date you didn't circle, through a process that moves faster than most people expect, until the morning you drive past your own gate and there's a notice stapled to it. Gerald said later that he had understood the bank's letters were serious and had still not quite believed, on some level, that it was going to go all the way to sale. A lot of people don't believe that until it does. The sale date was set for the third Thursday of April. Gerald had 11 weeks. What he did with those 11 weeks had almost nothing to do with lawyers, though he had one. A woman named Patricia Dorn in Columbus who charged $175 an hour and who told him in their first meeting, clearly and without softening it, that his options for stopping the sale were limited. The redemption period had passed. The bank had followed procedure. The case was going to go where it was going. What she could do was make sure the process was clean and that his interests were protected through it. What Gerald did with those 11 weeks was study. His father, Leland, had survived a depression and a world war and 40 years of farming by knowing things that most people around him didn't bother to know, and by understanding that the time to learn something was before you needed it, not after. He had a saying that Gerald had heard so many times as a child that it had stopped sounding like wisdom and it started sounding like furniture. Know the rules of the room you're in. Leland had applied this to farming, to equipment purchases, to grain contracts, to everything. He had applied it to the 2 times in his life he had dealt with banks. He'd told Gerald once, sitting at the same kitchen table Gerald now sat at, that a bank in a hurry was almost always a bank making a mistake, and that if you understood the mechanism of what they were doing, you would almost always find a gap between what they wanted and what they could actually get. Leland had learned this from a man named Harve Ostrander, who had lost his farm in Dodge County in 1931, and then watched a neighbor buy it back at the sheriff's sale for 30 cents on the dollar of the mortgage balance, because the neighbor had understood that nobody else was going to show up with money on a Tuesday in January in the middle of a financial collapse. Harve had told Leland, "The price at a distressed sale is whatever the room is willing to pay, and you can know more about what the room is willing to pay than the bank can, if you work at it." Leland had told Gerald. Gerald had filed it alongside all the other things his father said that sounded like furniture until you needed a chair. He needed a chair in the winter of 2009, and he pulled it out. What Gerald Tatum learned over 11 weeks of research that involved the Colfax County Assessor's Office, 3 years of comparable land sales in the county, 2 conversations with a farm appraiser in Fremont named Bill Swick, who did not know why Gerald was asking, but who answered his questions honestly, and a careful reading of the foreclosure sale notice itself. Was this? The bank's appraisal of $280,000 was based on a comparable sales analysis that had been run in September of 2008, before the full weight of the credit crisis had compressed agricultural land values in that part of Nebraska. By March of 2009, similar bottomland ground in Colfax County was trading, on the few occasions it traded at all, in the range of $185,000 to $215. 000 for comparable parcels. The bid floor the bank had established, based on their appraisal, was $196,000, 2/3 of the appraised value, as required by the redemption statute. The bank expected to get close to their floor, maybe over it, if there was competition. Agricultural foreclosure sales in early 2009 were not drawing competition. Gerald knew this from the Bill Swick conversation and from the county records, but he wanted to see it, not just read it. He attended 2 other foreclosure sales in the 8 weeks before his own. He drove to both. He did not tell either auctioneer who he was or why he was there. He stood in the back with his hands in his coat pockets and watched. The first sale was in Platte County in late February. A 180-acre dryland operation, sandy loam soils, moderate productivity. The bank's appraised value had been $198,000. The floor was set at $132,000, 2/3, same statute. 2 bidders showed. They went back and forth 3 times. The ground sold at $121,000, which was $11,000 below floor, meaning the bank's own floor had come in too high for what the room could bear, and the statute required them to accept the top bid regardless. The bank took a loss of $77,000 against their note. The auctioneer closed it and moved on, the way auctioneers do. Gerald drove home in the dark and wrote $121,000 in the notebook and underlined it. The second sale was in Dodge County in mid-March. Similar acreage, better ground, irrigation. This one drew nobody. No bidders at all. The bank's representative, a woman, this time, in a good coat, submitted the credit bid from the bank to protect their collateral position and the farm transferred to the bank's Rio portfolio. The bank now owned a farm they had not wanted, in a market where they could not sell it, at a book value that no longer reflected what the ground would actually bring. Gerald had seen this before in his father's stories. He had not expected to see it in person. He drove home from Dodge County and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and revised the notebook. The number he settled on was $194,500. It was $1,500 above the bid floor, enough to beat the floor, not enough to look like he had a number in mind. He had thought about whether to go to $200,000 or to $196,500. He decided on $194,500 because it was specific in a way that felt considered without feeling strategic, and because he had $197,300 in a savings account at a credit union in Schuyler that was not First County Bank, and because he was not willing to spend more than $194,500 on a piece of ground he already owned. Not because it wasn't worth more. Because he knew what the room was willing to pay, and he knew he was the room. He drew the cashier's check on a Monday. The sale was Thursday. The Colfax County Courthouse steps were not crowded on the third Thursday of April, 2009, at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was cold for April, 38 degrees, when Gerald had left the house. Frost still on the windshield of his Ford F-350, a sky the color of old concrete that had been threatening rain since the day before and hadn't delivered. The courthouse in Schuyler was a brick building from 1914 with a wide front landing and steps that went down to a sidewalk and then to a parking lot where the old elms had been taken out years ago, and the lot looked raw and exposed without them. A man named Don Rieger, who had been a licensed auctioneer in Colfax County for 26 years, and who ran most of the county's tax and sheriff sales, stood on the top step with a clipboard and a handheld microphone plugged into a portable speaker he'd brought himself, because the courthouse's outdoor sound system had been broken since 2007, and nobody had budgeted the repair. Rieger was 61 years old that April. He had called sales on everything from Hereford bulls to John Deere 4440s to 3-bedroom houses with foundation problems. And he had a way of making even distressing transactions sound procedural and fair, which was most of what his job required. There were 9 people in the parking lot and on the steps. Gerald knew 4 of them by name. 2 were neighbors from his road. Men who had come to see what happened. The way you go to a neighbor's auction, not because you want to buy anything, but because the community around it matters, and you want it known you were there. One was Patricia Dorn, in a gray coat, standing near the base of the steps with a leather folder under her arm, who caught Gerald's eye when he arrived and nodded once without saying anything. The 4th was a man from First County Bank's Loan Recovery Department named Staubach. Gerald didn't know his first name and never learned it, who was standing apart from the other 8 people the way a person stands when they are at a courthouse step sale as a function, not as a person, and who was holding a manila envelope that Gerald understood contained the bank's credit bid. Gerald had dressed the same way he dressed to go to town. Work pants, a canvas coat over a flannel shirt, boots that needed resoling. He was not going to dress for this. He was not going to look any different on this morning than he had looked on every other morning he had driven to Schuyler in the past 30 years. He walked up the steps and stood on the landing and waited. Staubach looked at him when he arrived. Gerald nodded at him the way you nod at someone you recognize but do not know well. Staubach nodded back. Neither of them said anything. Don Rieger called the sale at 10:03. He read the legal description in the measured cadence of a man who has read legal descriptions aloud several hundred times. The south half of Section 14, Township 17 North, Range 2 east of the 6th Principal Meridian, Colfax County, Nebraska, 312 acres, more or less. He stated the bid floor, $196,000 as required by the redemption statute. He asked for opening bids. Gerald Tatum raised his hand. He said $194,500. Riger paused. He said the floor was $196,000. Gerald said he understood that. He said he'd like to open at $194,500 and see if the bank would accept it as an opening bid under their discretion. Riger looked at Staubach. Staubach opened the manila envelope, looked at something inside it, and made a brief call on a cell phone. The call lasted about 40 seconds. He came back and said the bank would not accept below floor. His voice was even. He was doing his job. Gerald said that was fine. He raised his bid to $196,100. Nobody else bid. There were 9 people on those steps and in that parking lot, and not one of them raised a hand or spoke a number. Staubach held the manila envelope in both hands and looked at the lot and did not open it. He had instructions that said to protect the bank's position against a total loss, to ensure the collateral didn't sell below floor. At $196,100, the bank's position was protected. Staubach was not there to run a price war against the man whose land this had been. He had a job, and he had done it. Don Riger called it once. He called it twice. He called it a third time, and the gavel came down at 10:09 in the morning. Gerald Tatum paid $196,100, not $194,500, the $196,100. He'd had the second number ready since Sunday night, written in the margin of the spiral notebook, because he had thought through the possibility that Riger would hold the floor and had decided what he was willing to do about it. He was willing to pay $196,100. He was not willing to pay $197,000. There is a number past which knowing the room is not enough, and Gerald Tatum knew his number. He walked to the clerk's window and completed the paperwork at 10:47. He was in the parking lot by 11:10, certificate of sale in the chest pocket of his canvas coat. He drove home on the same county road he had driven to work for 30 years and pulled in his own lane and went inside and made a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spiral notebook for a while without writing anything. The phone call to Patricia Dorn lasted 4 minutes. She said she was glad it went that way. She said she hadn't been sure it would. He said he hadn't been either, not entirely. His daughter called at 6:30 that evening. He told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she didn't understand how he had known what to bring. He said his grandfather, Harv Ostrander, had figured it out in Dodge County in 1931, and his father, Leland, had kept it. And now he supposed he had it too. She asked him what it was. Exactly. He said it was just paying attention to the room you're in. Knowing what the room could actually do, not what you hoped it would do. He said most people in a hard situation spend their time on what they wish was true. His father had spent his time on what was. Gerald Tatum farmed the 312 acres for 9 more years after that April morning. He paid off the First County Bank note in full. The bank had received $196,100 at the sale, which satisfied the foreclosure judgment. And the ground was clear, and he ran a clean operation on it from 2009 through 2017. He replaced the woven wire on the south pasture fence in 2011. He overhauled the center pivot in 2013. New drive motors and a new drop tube system on the east side where the old risers had been leaking since the second year. He kept his records the way Leland had kept his records, in a file box in the shop, everything dated and organized and easy to find if you knew what you were looking for. He sold the ground in the spring of 2018, when he was 63, and his left knee had been replaced once, and was telling him it might want to be replaced again, to a young couple from Stanton County named Veit, Travis and Kelly, who had been looking for irrigated bottomland ground for 2 years and who paid $487,000 for the 312 acres. That came to $1,561 an acre, against the $628 an acre Gerald had paid for it on those courthouse steps 9 years before. He did not think of the $1,561 as a vindication. He thought of it as the price. The way prices work when time passes and you have kept something in good condition and the market has recovered its sense. He told Travis Veit, when they shook hands on the deal in February of 2018, that the pivot needed the left-end tower wheel replaced before the next growing season, and that he'd meant to do it in the fall and hadn't gotten to it. Travis said he'd handle it. Gerald left the maintenance file in the shop, organized by year and by system, the way Leland would have wanted. He didn't tell Travis what was in it. He figured a man who bought ground would look. The pivot is still there. The grain bins are still standing. The Veits put a new metal roof on the equipment shed the second spring they owned it, which Gerald had been meaning to do since 2015, and hadn't. Gerald lives in Schuyler now. The credit union where he kept the $197,300 has changed hands twice and carries a different name on the sign above the door. First County Bank closed in 2013, absorbed into a regional holding company out of Lincoln that kept the building for 2 years and then sold it to a dental practice. He doesn't think about any of that much. He's not the kind of man who spends time thinking about institutions. He kept the spiral notebook. It's in the second drawer of a dresser in the house in Schuyler, underneath a Farmers Mutual insurance policy from 2007 that no longer applies to anything, and if you opened it you'd find 9 pages of land sale comparables written in Gerald's handwriting, a column of numbers in blue ink on the right margin, and 1 line at the bottom of the last page that says $196,100 and is circled twice. He wrote both circles in pencil, the way his father wrote things he was still deciding about. He never erased them, because the number turned out to be exactly right, and you don't erase a number that turned out to be exactly right. Leland Tatum told his son a lot of things across the years they farmed together. Most of it sounded like furniture until Gerald needed it. That is probably how it was always meant to work. Knowledge that sits quiet in a sun, waiting for the morning it's needed, for the room that finally asks the right question of it. Some rooms only open once. You want to already know the rules when they do.